Can you do a video on how to distinguish between healthy romantic love and one in which we are codependent or abandoning ourselves? It often feels good to give in a relationship, I agree, until you wake up and realize you were not getting what you needed. In return, oh boy, it looks like we're going to have a triggering conversation about trauma bonds, which means that we're going to have to discuss abandonment and idealization, two very important topics if we're going to move ourselves from unhealthy to healthy relationship patterns. But I want to be clear before we begin the video, this is not a Google self-diagnosis session. This isn't the equivalent of typing sore throat and then realizing that you have 10 terminal illnesses. Romance and relationship is incredibly complex because we are two complex individuals creating a third thing together. And a video like this video, where it's trauma bonds and toxicity and ideal healthy relationships, is a very tricky kind of discussion to have, because I don't want you to overly latch onto this idea of a trauma bond, and if I start talking about signs and symptoms of trauma bonding, that you rapidly reject or even just discard a living human being when it could just be healthy relationship conflict. I refuse to make a video which plays into this idea that the person who's alone in their house or maybe out on a walk is watching a video on trauma bonds or narcissism or toxicity, and they are the powerless victim, and therefore they are by default the empathic, more sensitive, more spiritually aware individual, and they're probably dating the narcissist or the tyrant or the abuser. Yes, that might be the case for some people, but I don't like that style of video. So we are going to discuss trauma bonds. We are going to go into the psychology of abandonment and idealization. I am going to give you ways and book suggestions to help you shift that pattern, but I do need to be excessively clear from the start of this video. I do not like that narrative victimization structure where I'm going to speak like this and say that the trauma bond is something where you really suffer and you don't know what's going on. There is such a thing as abuse, but my audience, in general, is a very intelligent, very grounded, and very discerning group of individuals, so I'm not going to speak towards that self-defeating narrative. We're going to look at the core issues. I'll start with the books. 2 books I recommend you read. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. Here they are. You can pause the video. It's Eden Project by James Hollis and Invisible Partners by John Sanford. 2 incredible psychological takes on romantic infatuation. But let's get to the center of this question. How do we know if we're in a healthy relationship and it's a piece of conflict? It's a season of dispute based on some kind of inner or outer experience as opposed to a trauma bond. In all reality, I don't think you need me on a video explaining or describing what a trauma bond is to tap into that intuitive sense that something is a little bit more disturbed than a regular conflict. Usually, if you start to search for videos like, am I in a toxic relationship or am I in a trauma bond, you've already pre-decided that you are indeed in a toxic relationship or a trauma bond. Yes, the trauma bond, psychologically speaking, is a way of relating to another human being which feels familiar to something which usually happened in early childhood. This is the young girl who bonds with her father by being the princess or the good girl, or the young boy who bonds with his father by being the champion, the superstar, the star. Insert the blank. He is going to be larger than life and he's going to win the admiration of his father. Both of these 2 individuals, they grow up and the girl becomes a princess, good girl, people pleaser. The man becomes a superstar. It's all about me. And they come into a relationship together as just one example, because those are the patterns which were reinforced as the way to acquire love when they were children. We can give a different set of examples, a trauma bond for a different man and woman, or whatever situation we're going for in regards to an individual pattern as extended out through a life story, could be the young girl Let's say she is 10 years old who wants to get close to her mother, and she's realized that the way to be close with her mom is to basically be distant, which is quite the strange situation to think about. This is the avoidant daughter. The avoidant daughter has a trauma bond to her anxious mother by staying out of the conflict zone, but then coming back in when they can do small things to start to hide the family secrets or help mom feel better. This is the 10-year-old girl who will cover up the mom's alcoholism by taking the bottles and putting them into the recycling or cleaning up the ashtrays, right? This is a deeply codependent, avoidant initially, but then kind of flanking in to be this pseudo-supportive figure kind of pattern. Of course, she's going to grow up and be that kind of woman for probably the same kind of partner, someone who's got an addiction issue. Or maybe the young boy, he has a pattern where, what's going to be relatable? Let's imagine the young boy has a pattern of being a conqueror in an intimate sense. He's a real ladies' man because he was encouraged from an early age, a young age, that his way to get love and attention is to be charming and seductive in a very strange sense. It's not the right word, because I do not want to be misunderstood that a young boy is being seductive. I think that's disgusting. I do not agree with that kind of language around sexuality. I'll say it that way. I try to avoid that word on these videos just in case it gets flagged or censored. But there is something about charm which is often very normalized, and this is the comments of, say, a 5 or 6-year-old boy. The moms and the aunties and the friends will be like, ooh, when he grows up, he's going to be a real ladies' man. He's going to be a real killer heartbreaker. He's going to be like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Imagine being a young boy, even if you're a confident, charismatic young boy, and you've got your mom and all of her friends, and they're bigger than you, and you get the feedback that when you come in like this and you're topless with like a big bravado and a swagger as only a 6-year-old boy could be when he's imitating the alpha men that he sees on television or wherever he might see them. If your mom and her friends are saying, yes, this is what we like, this is how we like you, keep going, keep going, keep going. That young boy has very few options in terms of his romantic narrative other than reinforcing that same trauma-based, affection-seeking dysfunction. He wasn't given the option to be rewarded for anything other than his charm, his charisma, and his infantile version of seduction. It's a very strange dynamic to unpack because many men who would be watching this video to some degree or another can relate to what is a healthy version of motherhood, which is, oh, my little boy, you're so handsome and you're going to be a real hit with the women when you're older. That can be healthy because it's improving his self-esteem in the same way that a father may say to a daughter, you're so beautiful and any man would be lucky to have you. High self-esteem, good self-worth. Of course, I'd hope at the very least that these parents are also complementing the effort of the children, they're complementing the work ethic, they're complementing the creativity, the sensitivity, all the elements of identity that make children wonderful, wonderful beings, not just their looks and their charisma. But we can see how trauma bonds start to begin in that childhood feeling of abandonment. And you might pause and think, well, there's no abandoning happening. There's no explicit abandoning. Sure, it's easy to see that if there was an absent mother or an absent father, the child is left in a longing state for the missing parent or maybe missing parents. But the emotional abandonment which underpins some of the root wounding of the trauma-bonded individual is that they were selectively accepted and selectively abandoned depending on certain character traits. The little girl who went into the people-pleaser, codependent trauma response to try and cover up her mother's alcoholism and be out of the firing line of any kind of conflict, but also stay close enough and show that she can be supportive and show that she can be worthy of being around mom because she cleans up the bottles and empties out the ashtray and becomes a little human adult. She is selectively abandoned because she is not accepted when she's in anything other than that. The same for the little boy who is being the superstar superstar football player, or maybe the superstar pseudo-ladies man mini Casanova, he's being accepted and he's being explicitly praised by the men and women around him, let's say, but he's also being selectively abandoned for the sides of him which may not be desirable. Maybe his artistic side, maybe his ability to be quiet and by himself and not doing anything interesting. What an interesting pattern that is in itself. The little boy who sits alone and enjoys playing with his Legos, enjoys drawing something, enjoys writing a story, or maybe playing with some musical instruments, but because he's got a certain type of parent, he's not encouraged to be on his own, so his selective love, which is given to him, is poured into a false extroversion. Playing with the dynamic here, of course, there's many possibilities. I'm just throwing out a variety on this abandonment pattern because it's the first half of the trauma bond situation. If the little boy was naturally more introverted, more quiet, more imaginal, more kind of creative energy, and he was encouraged explicitly and often quite forcefully to be more extroverted than he may want to be, he learns that his only way to get love is through a pseudo extroversion. And maybe a girl has the exact opposite pattern. Maybe she was larger than life as a 6-year-old girl, and her mom or her dad or her uncle, her auntie, her school teacher progressively tried to dampen her down. No boy likes a loud girl. Stop being so sporty. Boys won't like you for this. Nobody likes a big mouth, a chatterbox, whatever it might be. All of these little moments, all of these moments from childhood of being selectively abandoned, they form the foundation that the adult walks upon when it comes to all of these toxic and traumatizing relationships. How does the child deal with abandonment? They start to idealize. They have a fantasy projected image of what's given to them by their parent. The young boy who's given the image of superstar athlete or mini Casanova is given the golden shadow, the ideal fantasy projection that he's going to play, which means that he is set up in such an extreme position that he can only have a very limited range of possible romantic partners. In a classic scenario, that kind of boy is going to go for the same kind of girl who's also the quiet, people-pleasing, and potentially if there's addiction involved or any kind of destructive behavior, let's imagine he does become the star athlete in college, and let's imagine that he copes with the stress of trying to be the star athlete and get the perfect grades on the exams, that he turns to drugs. It's very likely that he's going to attract a girl on a night out who is okay with the fact that he's yet again throwing up in the bathroom toilet, and she's going to be there when he's done to wipe up the vomit from the floor, because later on, maybe, if she's lucky, she's going to get a cuddle and a kiss on the forehead and the "thanks babe, you really look after me." Oh wow. Oh, he's so rough and he's so focused on work and on his sport, and he doesn't really give time to anyone else, but me, he gives all the time to me. Because she's in that same dysfunctional, selectively abandoning pattern. He's the ideal, she's the ideal, and they're both mutually engaged in this very strange shadow, compulsive, unconsciously draining dynamic. Neither of them are truly authentic. Neither the man nor the woman in this particular scenario, again, one of dozens of possible scenarios I could bring forward for a video like this, neither the man nor the woman are authentic people. They might have elements of authenticity which were genuinely picked up when they were children. Maybe the charisma of that young boy when he was 5 or 6 was genuine charisma, and he's a particularly confident performer. But it went a bit too far, and as it incrementally went further and further over 5, 10, 15 years, he became trapped in that mask that he can't take off, and if he goes all the way deep into his own inner child work and he looks at the wounds from those early years, he might realize that he wants to be left alone and not performing on the stage. And actually, if he were really to give himself the gift that he needed, he probably wants to be left alone for about a week to write a story about something which is entirely non-productive. He wants to be creative. Just one example, and maybe the little girl, if she was really given the opportunity to be authentic, she went back into, well, the adult going back into the little girl, she would realize that what she really wants to do when her boyfriend is throwing up in the toilet after yet another unexpected but sudden, I'm sorry, I just had to go out, you know what the boys are like, kind of night, she says, I love you so much, I can't do this anymore. Something's wrong. Can you see that something's wrong? And if he says, yes, I can see that something's wrong, which most calibrated people can see. Some people, they're too far gone and they can't see that binge drinking, as one example, is something which needs to be removed from life. Let's imagine that he is willing to work on it. If she comes away from that moment of emptying out the ashtray for the addicted mother, and she develops that courage, that ability to speak up and call out the nonsense of that kind of addictive pattern, that's where she starts to break the trauma bond, because the idealized mix of pain and hope and this love that could never quite be, all wrapped up in addiction, that starts to get depotentiated, or the energy starts to be drawn out of the fantasy image of what she needs to be for the person whose love she's seeking. That all starts to unravel when she has adult conversations rather than repeats the childhood pattern. And if the superstar athlete, incredible alpha male fantasy figure in this stereotypical example could also then come to a moment where he's like, wow, I actually haven't got it all figured out, and this isn't something that I can continue, and I'm not going to just do the thing that my dad encouraged me to do, which is forget about the times that it hurts and just go get the next girl on a date and go get better on the grades. And if he can get that revelatory moment as well, they both start to break down the trauma bond. The trauma bond in terms of adult-adult relating is not something which needs to be permanent. We're getting into the practical advice part of the video to wrap this up. The trauma bond is something that may begin in trauma, but if two healthy enough, willing adults realize that they're caught in these unconscious shadow dynamics, they can start to heal together. Most people watching this video, I would imagine, are either dating or have dated someone who is open and conscious to at least some significant degree. I need to give you credit. Unless you were really in a particularly unconscious position in your life, you were unlikely to choose someone who, again, is the devil incarnate. We have to be tricky there, because idealization and demonization are two sides of the same coin. If you start to call them all of the curse words under the sun, and just a few months ago they were all of the sun itself, you probably are still caught in that lopsided unconscious dynamic between angels and demons, which is about the level of consciousness. If you look at something like Ken Wilber's Levels of Consciousness of Archaic Mythic Reality, where the world is truly defined by invisible good and evil forces, rather than a more rational perspective, or even a more loving perspective, more the center of the chest, middle of the mind and the gut feeling all combined. You probably chose someone who was roughly, if you're going to be honest, anyone that you've dated at any point in time, they need to be roughly within the same level of consciousness as yourself. You haven't been so naive and so stupid to think that you were someone, you were the gifted empath, you were the spiritual individual, and you just made a poor decision because you felt sorry for them. Probably not the case. It's a bit of a sacrifice of self-responsibility if you believe that you're the one who's in the right, they're the one who's in the wrong. It's not a place to build a healthy relationship from. It's probably an indication that there's some more inner work to have taken place. I can relate to it, triggering topic, I've been there myself. The point is, let's be honest with ourselves. The trauma bond forms between two people who've had matching wounds in childhood, and they both relate to each other as somewhat of an authentic self, but also a considerable amount of inauthenticity, a considerable amount of persona games, and all kinds of shadow dynamics. If they can catch the moments, if they can see the conflicts, and if they can peel it back conversation by conversation, maybe even go into couples therapy, maybe reading books like The Invisible Partners and The Eden Project, they can start to be healthier men and women. And when they're healthier men and women individually, they can join together as a healthy third thing. The relationship starts to become something which is healthy. The trauma bond is identified in moments of conflict, moments of extreme emotion, and moments of clear dysfunction. But it's our job as adults who are seeking healthy relationships to neither romanticize nor demonize ourselves or our partner. If you start to notice that you're complaining or gossiping or otherwise talking down about your partner to your friends or your family, or you're doing the exact opposite, which is overly inflating them and talking them up all the time. Oh, she's the best. She's a goddess. She is literally, oh my God, she's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. There's a healthy amount. It's charming. It's sweet. I get it. If you call your girl, you are the most beautiful girl in the world. I love you with all my heart. There's no one else that I want. You are it. And you mean that truly at the deepest sense of your core. Fantastic. But often the games that we play as men and women is that we go a little bit too far in both directions. And then it comes out in arguments, which is why people then start swearing at each other in arguments. It's overblown from the beginning because the foundation is built on stilts. And it's very easily toppled by a strong emotion. Usually a good way to tell if you are indeed in a healthy relationship is you can manage conflict without escalation. You can both downregulate, you can both self-regulate, and then you can co-regulate. This takes a lot of inner work from both individuals, but you would not be watching a video like this far into this video if you didn't want a relationship that's also like that. So we might as well aim for the ideal standard. We catch the trauma bond, we do our inner work, and together we create something more beautiful. It depends on the individuals and it depends on the relationship. It depends on the history. I gave just a few examples of the little boy or the little girl who had their certain survival strategies. I can't speak to everything in a video like this, but I hope it's abundantly clear that if you're going to take just a few things from this moment, you're going to forget the video existed, please buy the books. Just a final few sentences to wrap this up. It's your responsibility to take ownership of your projections of idealization and demonization. If you're watching videos like this one, and if you're tempted to start searching for trauma bond videos or narcissist empath videos or any kind of like toxic relationship video, just be aware that the way that these platforms work, including myself and how I work as a creator, the way that these platforms work is to play towards attention and emotion. It's to get you riled up in a feeling of injustice and victimhood. Even if it's said in a very soft voice, even if it's these are the top 5 signs that you might indeed be in a toxic relationship, you always feel like you're never understood. You always feel like you never feel like. Always and never. Pay attention to them. Always is an idealization or a demonization, and so is never. It's an overcharged position. The language structure itself is unbalanced because nothing can be everything. Interesting language there, Ryan. Just be aware of it. Just be aware of the times that you're trying to take off a mask. You're trying to unravel and unpeel and rip off an old game that you've been playing. Don't be too quick to just take another one off the shelf that you find on a YouTube homepage and put it right back on, and you're like, ooh, now I'm the empath and now I'm spiritually awakened, or ooh, now I'm actually the confident one who can speak up and say whatever I want and never be trampled over again. You've overcharged. Undercharged, overcharged. Undercharged, overcharged. What if we just find the middle point? It's a mature conversation. I hope this video has been useful. At the very least, you know what to do. It's this one, and this one. And that's the next one. But I recommend these more than that one. I am quite good when I'm speaking, but these guys are much better. Go for these, or this. Your choice. You're an adult.